I'm going to talk about taxes today because guess what? They're going up. Apparently by quite a lot, more than any other country in the G7 or the European Union. Why? We'll come back to that. But first, let's just remind ourselves of what Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, said after the last time she raised our taxes.
We have now drawn a line under the inheritance that I faced. Public finances are now on a firm footing, and also our public services are funded in a proper way. And we've now set the envelope for those public services for the rest of this Parliament, which means we're not going to have to come back for more.
We already had the highest levels of tax in this country for 80 years. That was prior to the last budget where Rachel Reeves raised them by another £40 billion. But after that, she did the media rounds and she was explaining that, look, I was left a £22 billion black hole by the Conservatives. I've had to fill that by increased taxation. However, I won't be coming back asking for more. I've drawn a line under the public finances. We're finally on a firm footing. Okay, well, fast forward 11 months, just a couple of days ago, here's Rachel Reeves.
As we get the forecast and as we develop our plans, of course, we're looking at further measures on tax and spending to make sure that the public finances always add up.
She's talking about raising taxes in the November budget again. And if the newspapers are to be believed, she's going to go big.
She's about to raise taxes more than any other G7 country. Look at this. Higher tax rises than Germany, the US, France, Italy, Japan and Canada. There are now warnings that she's going to raise income tax.
Why is this happening? Well, there's a few reasons, one of them being increased interest rates. But a big one is the welfare budget. It is soaring, £300 billion, and that just increases every year. Every year, more and more people start to claim out-of-work benefits. Is that all legitimate? Who knows? And it reminds me of something that Carl Benjamin said the other day. He described Britain as a welfare state with a country attached to it. And I thought, yeah, that's kind of true, because all of this talk about how politicians treat Britain like an economic zone, not really, right? Because they don't do a very good job of treating it like an economic zone. Our economic state of affairs is terrible, but they do treat it like a welfare state. And then I got to thinking about it a little bit more. It's not just a welfare state, is it? It's an international welfare state. People come here specifically to use the NHS so that they don't have to pay for healthcare in their own countries. They know that if they just rock up at the hospital and they're 8.5 months pregnant, the NHS is ultimately going to look after them. That's a terrible state of affairs. People are coming here from everywhere in the world by any means, even jumping on a rubber dinghy, getting to Britain, knowing that they will be looked after.
But remember, when your taxes go up again, today it's emerged that nearly £10 billion is being spent every year just on benefits for foreigners. Nearly 17% of all universal credit payments are given to non-UK citizens. Migrants who have arrived since January 2021 could end up costing taxpayers, are you ready for this? £234 billion.
17% of universal credit payments are going to people who don't have British citizenship. £10 billion a year. And yet Rachel Reeves is trying to tell you that she can't find any money to save anywhere. She's going to have to put your taxes up by loads. It's ridiculous, isn't it? If you add that £10 billion to the £12 billion that we're spending on migrant hotels, now you've got £22 billion of potential savings. Gut the foreign aid budget, you get that up to £30 billion. I've just saved you £30 billion and it has not negatively affected any British citizens. And yet for some reason, they insist that your taxes have to go up. Right. Let me just elaborate on that point for a couple of seconds, because you might be thinking that all sounds a little bit too easy, a little bit too good to be true. Is there really a switch you can press to save £30 billion a year? Yes, there is. And no, it's not too good to be true. That's why it's Reform Party policy. That's why the Tories are starting to copy it. Of course, the Tories have a terrible 14 years record in office, so take them with a pinch of salt. But yes, it really is that easy. And because Reform are just saying it and saying that actually we're just not going to spend money on these ridiculous things anymore, benefits are only going to be for British citizens, they're surging in the polls. The last poll I saw predicted them to get something like 440 seats, the largest majority in a century. Now, even if that poll is inaccurate or it doesn't quite end up like that, the point is very clear. People want that. They've had enough of socialism, whether it's being delivered by the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. The natural counterpoint here from someone who's in the Labour Party would be to say that, well, Labour are only going to start taxing the wealthy and the high earners more. That's how they're going to pay for this. Okay, the problem is the wealthy and the high earners already pay the vast majority of tax in this country. If you don't believe me, I want you to consider something. The majority of British people take more out of the state than they pay in taxes. 53% of people receive more from the state than they pay in. How is that possible? How is that possibly functioning like that? Well, I'll tell you how. Firstly, the high earners are paying all of the taxes. They are subsidising everybody below them. The top 1% of earners in this country pay 28.2% of the income tax. Right. At the same time, the government is borrowing money, £86 billion in the last year. A lot of the money that they borrow just pays off the interest on the debt we already owe, which is £3 trillion. My point is this: the way the system, the way the state is currently set up, cannot go on much longer. Eventually, people are not going to lend money to the British government because it's just going to be seen as kind of unreliable. Like, this country might collapse at some point. And if you keep trying to raise taxes on the rich and the high earners, they will leave. If someone's earning £150,000 or £200,000 a year working at Goldman Sachs, guess what? Sure, their life is great, but it could also be great in Madrid or in New York. And a lot of those people will just be looking to get out. So yeah, there's some food for thought for you. I don't think you can just endlessly tax the high earners and expect them to stay here and take it. They won't. Now, if you're wondering what exactly these taxes are going to be, I suspect it's going to be capital gains tax, removing the tax-free ISAs, income tax threshold freezes, things like that. But there are some people within the Labour Party who have some really fruity ideas about how you can just raise tens of billions of pounds. Have a listen to this.
The government should grasp the nettle and introduce a series of wealth taxes.
A 2% levy on men and women whose own assets are worth more than 10 million would affect only 0.4% of the UK population and raise £24 billion a year.
Okay, so this great idea is a 2% wealth tax on people who own more than £10 million worth of assets. And that's going to raise £24 billion a year. No, it's not. That's going to cost you an absolute fortune. And I'll tell you why. Imagine you've got £20 million. Pretty nice, right? But one day, Rachel Reeves decides that you need to give me 400 grand a year. Nothing else is going to change in your life. Services aren't going to improve or anything like that, but you just need to give me 400 grand a year. Right. And you're then working that out and thinking to yourself, you know what? In 5 years, that's £2 million. Well, I could buy a flat in Monaco for £2 million. And then the thought will occur to you, maybe I should just buy a flat in Monaco. Maybe I should go and live in Monaco. Right? Monaco is one example. Madrid, New York, all of these other places. If you put this kind of wealth tax in place, those wealthy people simply will leave. Of course they will. £20 million is like a lowball example. Imagine you're worth 100 million, right? You've built a big business in the UK. Fantastic. Good for you. You've employed loads of people. You've paid loads of taxes. A massive contributor. And now Rachel Reeves is saying, well, actually, in the next 5 years, I want another £10 million off you. From you personally, not from the business. You're just going to think, no, I'm going to close that business because do you know what? I've made enough to retire anyway, and I'm going to go and move somewhere else and live in the sunshine. All of those staff that I employ, they're going to be fired. All of the taxes, the national insurance contributions, you're not going to get those anymore. Look, some people might be really patriotic and say, sure, I'll pay an additional £10 million over the next 5 years, but the vast majority, let's be honest, are simply not. They'll either do everything they can to hide those assets or they will simply leave the country. But there's also more knock-on effects. Think about the additional taxes that wealthy people like that contribute to the economy. Every time they go and buy a Lamborghini or an Aston Martin or a Bugatti or whatever it might be, they're paying VAT, they're paying all of these or import taxes. They're paying all of these taxes. You will lose all of that. So once they go, you're not going to get the £24 billion because that figure obviously assumes that literally nobody flees the country when they would. And the people who do flee, especially if they're billionaires, right? Think how much they'd be handing over to Rachel Reeves. Just ludicrous. The people who do flee, they're going to take away an additional tax stream from things like VAT, capital gains tax, employers' national insurance contributions. It's such a ridiculous idea that would never work. And it's almost like Diane Abbott thought of this, right? Here's a bonus one that I found for you. This was on LBC, and it was a guy from Politics Joe who was saying, well, maybe we could just have a 100% inheritance tax on anyone whose assets are worth more than £10 million.
I'd be looking at a punishing inheritance tax.
Such a Lib Dem, aren't you?
Yeah, really, yeah. Me, a Lib Dem. So let's just pluck a figure out the air. Let's say over £10 million, 100% of that is returned to the state. And I would then revisit council tax.
100%?
Yep.
Well, that really would have a flight of millionaires.
Hang on, people simply leave. So anyone with more than 10 million would just leave the country.
Let them go.
A lot of the arguments I just made apply to this idea as well, and it's just ridiculous, isn't it? Even Ian Dale put the point to him that, don't you think everyone will just leave? And he was like, yeah, let them go. So what's the purpose of this tax? To simply drive wealthy people who already do pay some taxes in this country out of the country, and we can all just be a little bit poorer together. What? Why? Who does that help? That doesn't help anyone. So stupid, but that's the modern left. They're just driven by resentment rather than practical, rational, logical thinking. It's like none of them have ever even heard of the Laffer curve. Look, the brutal reality is this. Labour's socialist ideology has met with reality, and the two things are not getting along very well. What Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, should actually be doing right now is working on a plan to cut spending and cut taxes at the same time to go for growth. And some of you will be thinking to yourself, hey, that sounds a little bit like Liz Truss. Yep, sure does, because Liz Truss had the right idea and executed it in possibly the worst fashion imaginable. Everything all at once in a mini budget, with very little explainer about how this was going to work in the long term. And so the markets were shook and she was forced out of being Prime Minister and we just went back to socialism again. Unfortunate. Doesn't really matter. Rachel Reeves is not going to do that. She's going to raise taxes again. And more people who are currently working in this country and currently paying taxes are going to start to think to themselves one of two things. Hey, wouldn't it be better if I worked in a different country and paid fewer taxes and had a better quality of life? And they're probably right. And a lot of people are also going to think, hey, wouldn't it be better if I just stayed in this country and leached off the welfare state? And honestly, they're probably right as well. And that's a really dangerous situation because then next year, when there are even fewer taxpayers, she's going to have to raise taxes again on the ones who are still here. More of them are going to leave. And then the year after, she's going to have to raise taxes again. You can see how this is a bit of a doom loop, right? This is a very bad situation to start getting into. She's going to have to find a way to cut spending and cut taxes at the same time. It's basically the only hope that Britain has at this point. Anyway, I'll leave that there. I was going to start talking about whether it's a good idea to think about leaving Britain, but I've got some very mixed thoughts about that. So I'll talk about that in a future video. Thank you very much for watching. Please do like, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in a future video.